The captain's hand slid off the throttle before the rest of him followed. For 3 long seconds, nobody in the cockpit understood what they were seeing. Then, his head dropped and the first officer's voice cracked over the intercom, asking, then begging for any doctor, any nurse, any pilot aboard Flight 482. Amanda Croft looked up from her tablet. Down the aisle past 24 turned heads, a man in a jacket she had mocked 40 minutes earlier was already on his feet. Before this goes any further, picture yourself in that cabin. A stranger stands when nobody else can. What would you do in his seat or in hers? Stay with me, and if stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things are why you're here, subscribe now so you don't miss the ending. 40 minutes earlier, Ryan Kesler stood in the boarding line at gate 31 with his daughter's hand in his and a duffel bag that had seen better decades slung over one shoulder. Ava was 9, all elbows and questions, clutching a coloring book she'd already started in the car. Ryan wore the same brown jacket he'd worn through a dozen winters, the collar soft from washing a small tear at the cuff he kept meaning to fix. They shuffled forward with the rest of economy while first class boarded ahead of them, unhurried, sipping water someone else had poured. Amanda Croft came down the jet bridge in the middle of that group, scrolling an email, the kind of woman other passengers stepped aside for without being asked. She hadn't meant to notice Ryan at all, but his duffel caught the strap of her carry-on as they both funneled into the same narrow stretch of bridge. She stopped and exhaled through her nose, the particular exhale of someone whose morning had already spent more patience than she'd budgeted. "Some of us checked a bag," she said, not quite under her breath, so the rest of us wouldn't have to climb over people's whole lives to reach our seats. Ryan didn't fire back. He shifted the duffel higher and said, "Sorry about that," in a voice that carried no apology in it, only the practiced calm of a man who had absorbed worse from people who mattered more. Ava looked up at him, her cheeks going red, and he rested a hand lightly on the back of her head and steered her forward. Amanda moved past them toward the seats with extra legroom and an attendant who already knew her name. She didn't look back. Denise Ford watched the whole thing from the galley arms full of pillows and said nothing. She'd flown this route 11 years and had learned exactly when a word was worth spending and when a look did more. She watched Ryan settle into 34C with his daughter at the window, watched him check Ava's belt before his own, and something in the ease of his hands on that buckle made her pause half a second longer than the moment asked for. She couldn't have said why. "Dad, will you call the flight school when we land so they know we made it?" Ava asked, pulling out her crayons. "I'll call the second the wheels are down," Ryan said. "Gotta lock my hours for next week or they'll bump me off the schedule again." "You always say that." "And I'm always right." He smiled and pressed the coloring book flat against her tray and said nothing else about it, the way he never said much about the parts of his life that didn't need saying. The cabin filled. The doors closed. Denise made a final pass, counting heads out of habit, and slowed for half a step at row 34, her eyes catching on the worn brown jacket folded over Ryan's knees. Then the engines pitched up, the plane pushed back, and Denver's skyline tilted away as Flight 482 climbed into a clear morning. Somewhere over the Rockies, Ava leaned across the aisle toward the woman in the aisle seat, a stranger with kind eyes and a paperback she'd stopped reading. "My dad used to fly planes like this one," Ava said, proud and matter-of-fact, the way children announce things they've heard 100 times and never once doubted. "Before my mom died. He doesn't anymore, but he still knows how." The woman smiled, said something polite, and went back to her book. She didn't think much of it. But 2 rows up, Denise had bent to hand over a blanket, and the words reached her sideways, the way overheard things do, landing somewhere she wasn't braced for. She straightened slowly. Kesler. She turned the name over, and it snagged on something in the back of her memory, a name from a crew roster years old, a name she hadn't thought about since it stopped appearing on the schedule. Captain R. Kesler. She'd flown 2 trips with him early in her time at the airline, back when he had a reputation among crews as the kind of captain who talked to ground staff like they mattered, who remembered gate agents by name. One of whom had once held a departure 11 minutes, so a mother could carry her sick toddler off the plane without an audience. He'd left the airline 3 years ago. She remembered the quiet way it happened, no announcement, no goodbye tour, just his name gone from the roster. The month after, there'd been talk briefly, something about his wife. Nobody pressed because nobody ever did, and the talk moved on. Denise glanced toward 34, said, The man in the brown jacket was working a stuck crayon loose for his daughter. Patient, unhurried, nothing in his posture suggesting anything but a father on a Tuesday flight. She almost walked over. She almost said something. But 11 years in this job had taught her the particular danger of turning a coincidence into a conversation that embarrasses everyone in it. So she finished her round and told herself plenty of men shared a common name. It wasn't until she reached the front galley and turned to survey the cabin that she saw it. Ryan had rolled a sleeve helping Ava with her tray, and the watch on his wrist caught the light plain steel government issue, the kind men wore because it never stopped keeping time and never impressed anyone at a dinner party and never came off. Denise looked away first and busied her hands with the cart, while her mind stayed 2 rows behind her, circling one question it refused to drop. She let herself remember more than she had at first. A red-eye out of Denver years back, weather closing over the mountains, a young first officer white-knuckling the descent while Captain Kesler talked her through it without once raising his voice. He'd bought the whole crew coffee afterward at a gate whose machine was broken, walking 2 terminals over to make it happen. It wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines. It was the kind of thing that made people want to fly with someone again. She hadn't thought about that night in years, and now she couldn't stop. She wondered what had happened to a man like that, why he'd traded a captain's seat for a duffel with a torn cuff and a coach ticket in row 34. Whatever it wasn't hers to ask, not here. She tucked the thought away and kept moving. By the time the seatbelt sign clicked off, Amanda had already summoned an attendant twice, once for water at the right temperature, once because the child 2 rows back kept laughing too loudly at something on her father's phone. Denise handled both with the same even voice, and on the second added unprompted, "They're a sweet family, ma'am. She'll settle soon." Amanda didn't look up. "I'm not asking for a character reference. I'm asking for it to be quieter." Denise nodded once and moved on, though something in her jaw had tightened that hadn't been there a minute before. Amanda's tablet was open to a spreadsheet, rows of numbers, under a header that read, "Flight Crew Scheduling Optimization 3rd Quarter Review." She sat on the board of Meridian Airlines, one of 11 names on the letterhead, and this file had crossed her desk twice already that month. She'd approved it both times with a signature she barely remembered giving. Somewhere in the fine print was a line about trimming scheduled rest gaps to cut overtime. She had skimmed it. She had signed it. She had moved to the next item on a very long agenda. 2 rows ahead, a junior attendant leaned toward Denise as they passed. "You see next month's roster? They tightened the turnarounds again. I'm doing 4 legs a day now." "I heard," Denise said, and nothing else because there was nothing to add that wouldn't get repeated to the wrong person. It wasn't the first complaint she'd fielded that month. Crews had been grumbling for weeks about shorter rest windows and the way sick days had dried up almost overnight, even though nobody seemed any healthier. She'd raised it once informally with a scheduling coordinator who told her the changes came from the top and weren't up for debate at her level. She hadn't pushed. There were 100 small unfairnesses in this job worth choosing not to fight, and she'd assumed wrongly that this was one of them. Back in 34C, Ava had drifted half asleep against her father's arm, the coloring book slack in her lap. Ryan reached over without looking and straightened it before it slid to the floor. His eyes out the window on thinning cloud. He'd flown this exact corridor more times than he could count once from the other end of the plane entirely, though nothing in his face gave that away. He was just a father, watching his daughter sleep, thinking about a flight school payroll that needed balancing by Friday. The plane hit its first real turbulence past the Nebraska line, a hard drop and shudder that rattled a cart and pulled a gasp from half the cabin. Amanda's hand shot to the armrest, knuckles white, her tablet sliding off her lap before she caught it against her knee. 2 rows back, Ryan didn't move. He'd looped an arm around Ava, who'd startled awake and pressed into his side and murmured something too low to carry something that settled her within seconds. His other hand lay flat and still on the armrest. No white knuckles, no change in his breathing, the stillness of a man who'd felt far worse air than this and stopped being afraid of it a long time ago. Amanda noticed. She couldn't have said why she noticed, only that, in the half-second before the plane leveled, her eyes had gone to the man in economy instead of to her own hands, and what she saw unsettled her more than the turbulence had. A question formed and dissolved before she could hold it, chased off by the return of cabin service and the low hum of ordinary flight. Up front, Captain Daniel Wren had been quiet for the better part of 10 minutes longer than his first officer usually let pass, without a remark about the weather or the traffic ahead. When Ethan Rhodes finally glanced over, he found the captain gripping the yoke a little too hard, a sheen of sweat along his hairline that hadn't been there at pushback. "You good?" Ethan asked. "Fine," Wren said. "Just warm in here." He wasn't fine. A tightness had settled across his chest an hour into the flight, dull at first, easy to blame on coffee or an early wake-up, and he'd done exactly what he'd done twice before in the last 2 months. He waited it out, telling himself it would pass because reporting it meant grounding himself for review, and grounding himself meant losing points he couldn't afford under the airline's new attendance policy. 3 call-outs in a rolling year, and a pilot got flagged. Wren was already at 2. He had a mortgage and a daughter starting community college in the fall, and he'd made his peace with pushing through the way pilots had always pushed through things nobody outside a cockpit had to understand. The tightness didn't pass this time. It spread and sharpened, radiating down his left arm in a way that made the edges of his vision swim. He reached for the radio and found his hand wouldn't do what he asked of it. "Ethan." His voice broke on the word. Then his hand slid off the throttle, his head dropped forward, and the yoke shuddered under weight. It was never meant to hold alone. Ethan grabbed the controls with both hands, heart slamming, already shouting into the intercom before he'd finished processing it. "I need help in the cockpit, now. Anyone with medical training. Anyone." Denise was moving before the sentence ended up the aisle at a speed that startled the passengers she passed. She found Wren slumped sideways, breathing, but barely conscious, his shirt soaked through. A young woman in scrubs had risen from seat 19, calling herself a nursing student, but one look told Denise this was past what a first year could manage. They needed someone who understood aircraft, who understood what came next in a cockpit with one working pilot and a captain who could no longer speak. The intercom crackled again, Ethan's voice tight with a fear he was losing the fight to hide. "Is there a pilot on board? Any pilot, please make yourself known to a flight attendant." The cabin went still, in the particular way cabins go still when the machinery keeping them alive admits without meaning to that it is no longer entirely in control. Amanda's hand found the armrest again and gripped it the way she had in the turbulence, except this time there was no leveling out to wait for. Ryan felt the shift too, the change in the cabin's pressure that had nothing to do with altitude. He looked at Ava, gone rigid against him, and kept his voice low and even, the same voice he used when Thunder woke her at home. "It's okay. They're taking care of it. You stay right here with me." She nodded, small and unconvinced, and gripped his sleeve tighter. His eyes moved toward the open cockpit door, and the shape of Denise crouched beside the captain's seat, and something in him that had been dormant 3 years came quietly awake. He unbuckled and stood. "Dad." Ava's voice broke on the single word. He crouched to her eye-level hands steady on her shoulders. "I need to go help. I know how to fly this kind of plane, Ava. I flew ones exactly like it for a long time before you were born and after. I'm going to help them land, and then I'm going to come right back to this seat. Can you hold on to that for me?" She looked at him a long moment, the way children look at a parent when they're deciding whether to believe a thing all the way. And then she nodded, jaw tight. Fighting tears she was determined not to spend. Ryan moved up the aisle fast past rows of passengers who stared without understanding and reached Denise just outside the cockpit. "I'm a pilot," he said, quiet enough that only she and Ethan could hear. "Commercial ATP-rated current. I flew for this airline 7 years before I left." Denise's breath caught. Up close, there was no mistaking him. "Kesler," she said. "Ryan Kesler, you remember me? I remember you held a flight 11 minutes for a sick kid." He was already looking past her to the controls. She turned to the intercom. "Ethan, we've got a pilot, former Meridian captain." Ethan didn't have the luxury of doubt. "Get dispatch on the line. Verify his certificate against the FAA registry. Now, while I hold this thing steady." It took 90 seconds that felt considerably longer. Denise relayed Ryan's license number over the radio dispatch, ran it against the federal registry, and the confirmation came back clean. Active airline transport pilot certificate type, rated on this exact aircraft, no lapses, no violations. Ryan had kept his hours current for the flight school without ever once needing to say why it mattered so much to him. "You're cleared," Ethan said, and for the first time since the captain went down, something like relief broke through his voice. "Get in here." Denise and another attendant eased Wren out of his seat and into the forward galley where the nursing student took over watching his breathing while ground medical talked her through it on the radio. Ryan slid into the captain's seat, hands finding the yoke with a familiarity 3 years hadn't dulled, and for one moment, just one, he closed his eyes. Through the narrowing gap of the door before it swung shut, Amanda watched it all. The man in the worn jacket, the one she'd all but sneered at over a duffel bag, walked into that cockpit like it belonged to him. The door closed. The cabin held its breath. She realized her hand was still on the armrest, and for the first time all morning she didn't loosen it. Inside, Ryan ran the instrument scan, fast muscle memory doing the work his conscious mind hadn't caught up to. "Talk to me. What do we have?" "Altitude stable, autopilot's holding," Ethan said, hands white on his own controls. "But I've never flown this route without a captain. I don't know what the play is." "The play is we turn around," Ryan said. "Denver's 20 minutes back. We know the field and we can have full medical waiting on the ground if we call it now. Chicago's not worth the risk with an unconscious captain and a first officer landing this airframe solo for the first time." Ethan didn't argue. Ryan reached for the radio, his voice dropping into a register Ethan hadn't heard from him yet, calm in a way that steadied the whole cockpit around it. "Denver Center Meridian 482 declaring a medical emergency. Request immediate return to Denver. Captain incapacitated. First officer and relief pilot on board." The response came fast vectors, and priority handling the machinery of an entire airport, bending around one sentence. Ethan exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, and in that small opening, something slipped out of him he hadn't meant to say. He shouldn't have hidden it. Wren told me last week his chest felt tight sometimes, said it was nothing, made me swear not to log it. Ryan's hands didn't leave the controls, but his eyes flicked toward his first officer. "Why would he ask you to sit on something like that?" "Because of the points." Ethan's jaw tightened. "New attendance policy. 3 call-outs in a rolling year, and you're flagged for review. Could mean a downgrade, could mean your seniority slot. He was already at 2, didn't want a third on his file over what he figured was nothing." Just outside the door, close enough to hear through the gap, Denise had gone very still. "That policy?" she said, loud enough now that both men turned toward her voice. "I filed a complaint about it 4 months ago. I told operations pilots were flying through symptoms because they were scared of the point system, and I was told it was outside my purview." "Who signed off on it?" Ryan asked, though something in his tone said he already suspected the shape of the answer. "Gregory Hutton," Denise said, "Vice President of Flight Operations. He built the whole optimization plan around it. Tighter turnarounds, fewer rest gaps, and a point system to discourage callouts, because callouts were costing the airline an overtime and substitute pay." She paused, and when she went on, her voice had an edge Ryan hadn't heard from her before. "It went to the board for approval. It passed this quarter." In her seat, close enough to catch fragments of it through an intercom the attendants hadn't fully muted, Amanda sat frozen, her tablet still open to the spreadsheet she'd signed off on twice without reading past the summary. Flight crew scheduling optimization. Her own signature sat somewhere in the digital trail behind that policy. One name among 11 easy to forget the weight of, until it became the reason a man was unconscious on a galley floor at 30,000 feet. Ryan didn't have the luxury of sitting with any of it. He kept his hands on the yoke, his eyes on the instruments, and ran the descent checklist with Ethan, because whatever had caused this, whoever had signed. But none of it mattered if he didn't get this plane down first. The descent into Denver came fast and rough, low clouds breaking apart to reveal the familiar grid of runways, emergency vehicles already lined along the taxiway with their lights turning silently. Ryan talked Ethan through each stage, his voice never rising, his hands correcting the yoke through a crosswind that tried twice to shove them off the center line. "Gear down," Ryan said. "Gear down," Ethan echoed, and the confirmation clicked through a beat later. In the cabin, the seatbelt sign had come back on 20 minutes earlier, and the attendants moved through a final check with a practiced calm that didn't quite cover the strain in their faces. Ava sat rigid in 34C, both hands around the armrest, and the stranger beside her, the same woman she'd told about her father, reached over without a word and held her free hand. 2 rows up in first class, Amanda wasn't looking at her phone or her tablet or anything that belonged to the version of her life she'd boarded with. She was looking straight ahead at the seat back in front of her at nothing, working through the arithmetic of a decision she'd made without ever picturing a face attached to it. The plane hit turbulence on final, a hard shudder that pulled a collective gasp through the rows, and for one long second it dropped enough that the oxygen masks nearly released on their own. Ryan's hands moved fast, correcting steadying, and his voice came low and even over the intercom Denise had patched through without being asked. "Folks, this is the flight deck. We're on final approach into Denver. Wheels down in under 2 minutes. Stay seated, stay calm. We've got this." It was the first time most of the cabin had heard his voice, and something in its steadiness moved through the rows like a current. Shoulders loosening, breath slowing, even Ava's grip on the stranger's hand easing by a fraction. The wheels touched, hard, bounced once settled, and the reverse thrust roared, pulling the aircraft down to taxi speed on a runway lined with flashing lights and waiting ambulances. A ragged cheer broke out in economy, quickly hushed, replaced by the sound of a whole plane exhaling at once. Some crying, some laughing, most just sitting very still, absorbing the fact that they had made it. The moment the aircraft stopped, paramedics were up the jet bridge stairs before the door had fully opened, working past startled passengers to reach the galley, where Captain Wren lay conscious now, but pale, an oxygen mask over his face, the nursing student still crouched beside him, relaying vitals. They had him on a stretcher and moving within minutes. Ryan stepped out of the cockpit a moment later, and the applause that had been building since the wheels touched broke over him, in full passengers rising, some reaching to shake his hand as he passed. He didn't linger for any of it. His eyes found row 34, found Ava standing on her seat with tears streaking her face, and he crossed the distance in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding on the way a man holds on when he's just remembered exactly what he almost lost. "Told you I'd come back," he said into her hair. "You always say that too." She managed half a laugh, half a sob, and for a moment nothing else in the cabin existed. By the time they deplaned onto the tarmac, a small crowd of Meridian personnel had gathered near the terminal doors. Radios crackling, someone already filming on a phone. A ground supervisor quickly asked them to put away. Gregory Hutton arrived within the hour, summoned the moment word reached corporate that a captain had gone down mid-flight, and he moved through the crew with the practiced smoothness of a man who'd spent a career turning bad headlines into manageable footnotes. "A medical event," he told the small cluster of reporters who'd already caught wind of it. "Entirely unforeseeable. Our first officer and an off-duty pilot who happened to be aboard handled it with exceptional professionalism, and we're grateful the outcome was a safe one." Denise stood at the edge of the group, arms crossed, and when a reporter's microphone drifted close enough, she didn't wait to be asked. "It wasn't unforeseeable," she said loud enough to cut through Hutton's calm. "I filed a complaint 4 months ago about pilots flying through symptoms because they were afraid of losing points under the new attendance policy. That complaint is on record. Captain Wren told his first officer he'd had chest tightness for weeks and didn't report it because he was already at 2 call-outs this year." Hutton's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "That's an internal matter and not one for—" "It's not internal anymore," Denise said. "It just happened on live television." Amanda had been standing a few feet back, arms wrapped around herself against the wind off the tarmac, and she stepped forward, now her voice quiet but carrying. Hutton turned, and whatever composure he'd been holding slipped a fraction at the sight of her. "Amanda, I didn't realize you were on this flight." "I signed the scheduling optimization plan," she said. "Twice. You told the board it would improve on-time performance and cut overtime. You didn't mention it would mean pilots hiding heart symptoms because they were afraid of a point system you built. The policy wasn't designed to—" "I don't care what it was designed to do." Her voice didn't rise, and it didn't need to. "I care what it did. I watched a man collapse at the controls of a plane I was sitting on, Gregory. And I need you to understand that I'm not going to let this stay an internal matter." Hutton opened his mouth, found nothing useful to put in it, and closed it again. A short distance away, Ryan stood with Ava's hand in his, watching without stepping into it. No reason to insert himself into a fight that had never been his to have. He caught Amanda's eye once across the tarmac, and neither of them said anything. There was nothing simple enough to say, but something passed between them anyway, the particular understanding of 2 people who had just come through the same fire from opposite ends of it. Denise walked over a moment later and rested a hand briefly on Ryan's shoulder. "Thank you." "You'd have found someone else." "Maybe." She glanced back at Amanda, still rigid in front of Hutton. "Doesn't mean it wasn't you." Ava tugged at her father's sleeve, watching the ambulance doors close around Captain Wren with the wide, careful eyes of a child cataloging something she wasn't sure yet how to feel about. Is he going to be okay? They think so, Ryan said. They caught it fast because we turned around fast. That's the part that mattered. A lot of people did their jobs right today, not just me. He crouched, met her eyes. Ready to go home? She nodded and slipped her hand back into his, and they walked toward the terminal doors past reporters who didn't yet know his name and wouldn't hear it from him, past Hutton, still fumbling for language that might survive the evening news, past Denise, already on her phone requesting a formal meeting with the safety board first thing in the morning. 11 days later, the Meridian board convened an emergency session in a downtown Denver conference room, called at Amanda's insistence and scheduled with a speed the company rarely managed for anything short of a lawsuit. She stood at the head of the table with no notes and laid out the sequence without softening a single part of it. The optimization plan, the attendance policy buried inside it. The complaint Denise Ford had filed and been told fell outside her purview, and the captain who had hidden a cardiac symptom for weeks rather than risk a third mark against his record. I voted for this policy, Amanda said, meeting the eyes of every member in turn, twice. I read a summary page and I signed it. And 3 weeks later, a man nearly died because the pilots on this airline are more afraid of a point system than they are of their own chest pain. That's not a scheduling problem. That's a policy that punishes honesty. And I want it gone. Gregory Hutton, seated near the far end, tried twice to frame the incident as an isolated failure of individual judgment rather than a systemic one. Both times, Amanda cut across him with the same unhurried precision, laying documentation on the table that Denise had provided records of the ignored complaint, internal emails showing 2 separate safety officers had flagged the policy as a risk before its approval. The vote came 7-2. The attendance point system was rescinded effective immediately and replaced with a mandate that no pilot or crew member could be penalized for reporting a health concern, however minor. Hutton was suspended pending a full review, the file forwarded to the FAA's Safety Oversight Division for an independent look at how the policy had cleared internal review in the first place. Ryan attended as a technical witness seated near the back in a borrowed blazer that fit him better than the boardroom's chairs seemed to expect. When his turn came, he answered every question, plainly describing the cockpit, the descent, the decision to return to Denver, none of it dressed up as more dramatic than this had been. He didn't mention what it had cost him to walk back into that seat after 3 years away. Nobody asked, and he didn't offer. Afterward, in the hallway, Amanda found him gathering his coat. Thank you for coming. You didn't have to. Seemed important that someone in that room had actually flown the plane. She almost smiled. I owe you an apology for the jet bridge. You don't owe me anything. He shrugged the coat on. You fixed the part that mattered. Neither of them mentioned his years as a captain or her seat on the board or anything about the 2 lives that had briefly, violently intersected 30,000 feet above Nebraska. There would be time for all of that, or there wouldn't. For now, they shook hands, brief and professional, and went their separate ways down the same hallway. 3 weeks after that, the rain over Boulder let up just past noon, leaving the small regional airport smelling of wet asphalt and cut grass from the field beyond the runway fence. Ryan was under the wing of a single-engine trainer wrench in hand when a car he didn't recognize pulled into the gravel lot and parked beside his truck. Amanda stepped out in flat, sensible enough for uneven ground, no announcement, no assistant, just her, and a plain paper bag she held like she wasn't entirely sure why she'd brought it. She hadn't called ahead. She'd told herself twice on the drive up that this was a mistake and driven the rest of the way anyway. Ava spotted her first, came barreling out of the hangar office with a grease rag still in one hand. You're the lady from the plane. I am, Amanda said, crouching a little something in her posture looser than it had been on any tarmac. I heard you tell your seatmate a secret about your dad on that flight. Turned out to be true. He tells everyone eventually. Ava grabbed her hand without asking and tugged her toward the hangar. Come see the plane he's fixing. It's older than him. It is not, Ryan called after them, wiping his hands as he straightened from under the wing. And for the first time since Denver, something in his chest loosened at the sight of her, walking across his runway unannounced, holding his daughter's hand like it was the easiest thing in the world. They ended up at the fence line a while later. Ava off chasing a stray dog that wandered the airfield most afternoons. The two of them left standing side by side, watching a small plane taxi toward the runway threshold. Neither of them brought up the board or the tablet or the jacket she'd once made a comment about in a jet bridge that felt like it belonged to another lifetime now. "I don't know what I'm doing here," Amanda admitted, her eyes on the runway. "You drove 3 hours to find out," Ryan said. "Seems like a start." She laughed, quiet, surprised by it, and her hand came to rest on the top rail of the fence beside his. Neither of them moved it. "I read the FAA report this morning," she said after a while. "Ren's going to be fine. Full recovery. They cleared him for a desk role while he heals. He wants to write you a letter. Denise had to talk him out of tracking down your address himself. Tell him he doesn't owe me anything either. He was scared, that's all. I understand scared." "You didn't look scared up there." "I was terrified," Ryan said plainly. "No drama in it. I just didn't have room for it until we were on the ground." Amanda looked at him a long moment, something in her expression settling the way weather settles after a front finally moves through. Ava's laughter carried across the field, chasing the dog in wide, useless circles, and neither of them moved to call her back. The little plane lifted off, banked west toward the mountains, and climbed into a sky finally clear of rain. He had steadied her flight from 30,000 feet. Down here on solid ground, all she had to do was let her hand stay where it was and let herself for once stop performing long enough to be seen. So she did. If this story stayed with you, that's the whole reason I tell them. Drop a comment about the moment Ryan stood up. Would you have done the same, and hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it's ready?